Everybody's always saying I'm bumptious, the product of finishing school. Finished. I took her up to see the baby. She couldn't care less, perfectly natural. Was dying to peer into other rooms with shut doors and upstairs. Remembered house vaguely from Arundel's time. Talk of prefix privileges to shop in Oxford. Her white Mac and blue headscarf told again how she listened to Ted's radio program, how an English teacher was a fan of his. Terribly critical of Lady Arundel, the midwife's poor son who blushes whenever he meets her. Small wonder. Sunday, February 24th. I should have known it. My instincts were right. At 10:30, the doorbell rang. I should have answered it. I was in my slippers without makeup, my hair down on all sides when Claire came in. "I'm not too early?" "Oh, no," said Ted. He made her a cup of tea and she stood in the kitchen while I finished my coffee and Frida her bacon. I had made the mistake of saying I'd be interested in seeing her poetry anthology at school. Ted and I ridiculed it gently. I kept wanting to get to work, furious that Ted had invited anyone in. The morning gone, 11:30 by the time I gave her book back and said I didn't think I needed to keep it, which would have involved dropping it round before 10 tomorrow. Now I have a respite till April 4th in which I may get started on my book. She is shrewd, pushing, absolutely shameless. I shall ask Marjorie when the moment arrives to confine visits to afternoons. I must have my mornings in peace. Her incredible angling last night to get driven to the movies in Exeter. I want to see Fanny. How should I get there? It did not occur to Ted to offer to drive her. He suggested a taxi. I mentioned how he despised Maurice Chevalier and how Ted in particular disliked musicals. On the assumption that I am as fascinating as T, I shall be omnipotent, chauffeur, entertainer, hostess, if the occasion arises. A charming ignorance as to any difference between us. Her models, Brigitte Bardot and Lolita. Telling. Friday, March 2nd, drawn in spite of myself to ring the Smith's bell, having been to the bank at 5 minutes to 3 with 2 American checks, and imagined the boys would be horror-struck at having extra work before closing time. Then thought the S's might think it a snub if I went to town without Frida and didn't ask how George was. These dim things in back of it. I rang the bell and Marjorie popped to the door in her brown cashmere, very neat and fine. Went up, feeling ponderous and clumpy in my suede jacket and big green cord coat. "I like your coat," Marjorie said, in a way that made me feel the opposite behind her words. We sat in the sun-filled front room. I could see suddenly that the wallpaper was a glossy embossed cream and the ceiling a shiny embossed white, very newish. "I hope Claire didn't bother you." I saw immediately that Claire had retailed the whole of her 2 visits in a fashion which escapes me because I consider our life so natural, but which I can construct from her usual critical malices. Lady Arundel never looked smart when she came into North Taunton. Talked of the wallpaper. They had the bank house redecorated at the expense of the bank when they came, a new kitchen and bath, as the former man had been a bachelor with an old mother who had someone do for her. The bank allowed 15s for the parlor, 12.6 for the bedroom, and 7.6 for the spare room. Well, if that's all they feel the manager deserves, this is George's first managership. Late? Then a story about a darling boy in the Navy they knew who ended up marrying a terribly drab American girl with stringy hair to her shoulders. Why? She must have had money. He didn't have money. 2 terribly drab children. I read this as a sort of allegory, the usual infuriating assumption American girls have lots and lots of money. Felt terribly sorry for this poor girl. Then the bell, just as Marjorie asked me with no feeling and perfunctorily to stay for tea. Betty Wakeford. She came bounding up in a suede jacket with glasses. A long, dewy nose and open grin, and fresh, crimped, high-fronted hairdo done in Winkley that morning. "So sorry I didn't come to tea at your place yesterday." She had a pile of new books for Marjorie. A sense of their close relation. They talked of the hunt ball to be held in the town hall that night. Betty and Dick were going, and Hugh and Joan Webb, and the chemist, Mr. Holcomb, and his wife, Bulgy. Why? When strapless gowns came in, she wore one and bulged all over it. Marjorie's eyes glinted cattily. Later it occurred to me that Bulgy, whom I imagined as a drab fat, was probably the voluptuous blonde I'd seen off and on in the chemist's, a good excuse for cattiness. Betty would twist. She's seen how on the telly. I had the strong intuition Marjorie had peered into our life. All she needed to make a judgment had judged, and now our relation would be quite formal. Mine certainly will be. C shall visit if she visits, not live here as she might. I later sobbed for the poor heard-of American girl, and for the flat malice of people I keep dreaming into friends. Noticed for the first time a set of luster jugs on top of M's sideboard. a raw copper luster with pink highlights and a blue enameled band around the middle on which were badly painted fruits and flowers. What fruits? What flowers? Next time must see. Asked how George was, but Em really said nothing. Turned out Betty had seen him in the morning. I hope I didn't tire him out. A sly sense of being just by that much shut out. Friday, March 9th. Met Em in Boyd's. Do come up for just 2 minutes. I had Frida in her soiled pale blue snowsuit jacket. A completely different atmosphere. Me? She carried Frida up the steep steps, the wallpaper in the lower half of the hall, or rather on the lower half of the hall wall, up and down stairs. A pleasant pattern of a few wheat stalks in red, brown, and black on white. Ruth, down from London, in a rust-colored shantung blouse. To the left of the fire, George with his iron gray hair down in front, looking handsome and raffish, with a red silk handkerchief looped to counterfeit a bloom in his buttonhole. Very hot and snug. I had a glass of Bristol milk. Frida stared. They brought out a straight child's wood chair with a brown upholstered seat and 2 fine antique teddy bears, one huge with a naive, primitive expression. Big glass eyes and fur that had been pale lavender, worn now to smoky gray, and a little purple and black bear. Frida smiled. Em said Mr. Fursman was an admirer of hers. Have you seen her smile? Frida pushed the little bear through the chair back and onto the floor, threw down the big bear, laughed charmingly. Claire is trying to imitate Ted. A letter from C with a poem brought out about her trying to study and her brain being vacant. Last time, how Marjorie's glasses kept reflecting the light in glittering oblongs into my eyes. She was facing the bright bay window, and I could not look at her mouth or an ear, but forced myself to try to pierce the glancing shields of light to the eyes behind them. Got a headache. Continually deflected. R had seen a huge white owl in a toy shop in Gloucester Road. Her gray tight hair and Agatha Christie housefrau. We talked of the fine old toys. M told of going to a shop down a row of teddy bears with a friend. Now that's the only one with the right expression. The saleslady overhearing was delighted. That's just what I said when I was unpacking them. That's the only one with the right expression. April 18th. There have been many visits back and forth. Now there is the astounding and relieving fact of imminent departure. George had a heart attack. He is being retired from the bank. They are moving to Richmond, Surrey, baggage, and Claire is home from school on a month's Easter holiday. She came yesterday afternoon. I was on the toilet on the landing in a tangle of my workman's overalls. Heard the professionally husky voice. Anybody home? Ted went down. I hauled myself together and flew down. She wore a dark pea jacket, green blouse, and gold hair locket. Very pale pink lips and white complexion, auburn hair. Can I take Frida for a walk? I stared, smiled in my pleasant, obtuse way, which I so enjoy now that I am a scatty mother of almost 30. Walk? Walk? Isn't it the right time? She asked. I thought, she has been put up to it. Oh, any day but today, I said. Frida, as it happens, has been bitten by a crow. She was very upset. I've just been trying to get her to go to sleep. Claire admitted that the weather, suddenly cold, gray, and overcast, was not very good. I blithered on about the crow bite, how Ted had introduced Frida to this big black baby crow in spite of my motherly forebodings, and how the crow had indeed snapped at her and drawn blood. I knew Frida was pottering around upstairs in her bare bottom. Ted, very harassed, went up to do his Baskin article and put her away. He said later she had shat on the floor in the interval. I held and arranged the baby, nosing him idly like a bunch of white flowers. Saw George at the gate. Claire was asking me what I was going to do that afternoon. Could she help? I saw Marjorie more and more clearly behind this. Oh, I am going to mow the lawn, I said vaguely. I don't quite see how help. There's only one mower. I welcomed George. He looked very ruddy and Tyrolean in a green felt hat, walking tweeds and a cane. We talked about the crow. I think he had come to see how Claire was doing. She was very catty about her 80-year-old grandmother, whom she was to visit with her father the next day, he having asked for a bunch of daffodils to take. The old woman always talked business, so boring, thought she was older than she was and should therefore be respected, couldn't cook anymore, and insisted on serving terrible pastries. I felt very sorry for the old woman. George had never seen the property, so I led the two through the tennis court up onto the black hill of daffodils. Claire was holding Nicholas, pale and blinking in his white bonnet and knitted blanket. She had no feeling for him as a baby, a person. She was doing something, learning to do something like making a salmon kedgeree. She grew misty-eyed, even wet-eyed, now she was going to miss North Taunton. Oh, Claire, I jokingly said, I thought you were very eager to leave this dull town. Oh, no, not now that it came to the point, George said, somehow deftly fitting it in, that maybe now we would ask Claire down. I was dumbfounded. but only smiled obtusely. What in God's name, I thought, would she find of interest in staying with us? Then, of course, it came. A husband, or at least an entry ticket into literary London society. Ted had mentioned John Wayne was coming down, and they'd seen him on television. Then that Marvin Kane was down doing a recording of me for the BBC. So Marjorie emerged behind Claire's sudden helpfulness, very clever too, and advanced nostalgia for the town she couldn't, till this moment, stand. Claire left with George, a little defeated. The weather closed in and became very mean and cold. I got Frida out, and the lawnmower. Thursday, April 19th. Claire tripped in heels and a white silk scarf with large and fashionable black polka dots to collect the large bunch of 40 daffodils I had arranged to give George for the trip to the grandmother. I asked if Marjorie would be home that afternoon. Yes. I felt called upon to do something. Claire had remarked loudly and somehow meaningfully that she only had 2 more weeks in North Taunton. It occurred to me I was somehow intended to do something. Dinner, as I had once thought, seemed out of the question for 6 with Ted's family coming. So I stopped, after my shopping, to ask the 3 ladies, Ruth, Marjorie, and Claire, to tea on Saturday. I rang. Marjorie knocked from the upstairs bay window over the square. She was offish and a bit scatty, as if something had not come to pass. Her first remark was about trying to fit the furniture into the rooms of the new flat, hopelessly. I thought that if they had cut the price of their imitation old-fashioned Welsh dresser, refractory table, and unsatisfactory wheelback chairs by 2/3 from the preposterous £150, we might have relieved her of some of her baggage. I sat for a minute in the sunny room, noticing the huge, ugly floor lamps, one of a giant size, and both with frightful shades, frightful in pattern and color, too. Almost immediately the bell rang. It was a Mr. Bateman from Sampford Courtenay with an aged terrier named Tim, whose muzzle was gray, he was 12 years old, and who shook upsettingly as if with palsy. Mr. Bateman was very stiff and dapper. A sky blue chiffon neckerchief, cinnamon-colored check tweeds. We spoke perfunctorily of animals after my crow account of mynah birds, talking crows, and the like. I rose to leave just as Ruth melted into the room, stooped a bit effacingly, her gray hair tightly crimped from the hairdressers in Exeter. Marjorie accompanied me downstairs. I made much of the coming arrival of Ted's relatives and the immense work they would involve. Recollections. Ruth came to tea alone, talk almost solely of her very fat girl head in Athlone and suspicious advances by monks and gay priests. Chucking her under the chin, asking to accompany her to horse races, playing tennis, etc. My reply almost continually, I didn't know priests would do that. My. The incredible fixed reminiscences of a spinster, her looking out at German bombers, realizing she was in a nightgown and retreating in blushes from the window, and the ring of young men leaning from neighboring windows. Then the scone and Devon cream tea for Frida and me at the Smiths, Frida glowing and beautiful and good at table, everybody, Ruth especially playing with her, she seizing on a few fuzzy animals that were conspicuously put out. Of a koala bear, Claire said, it was bumpy and stiff. Marjorie chided, oh, you mustn't say that of something you are trying to sell. The odd ambiguity. They have given us large old bears, old baby pillow slips by the half dozen. Then they bring out books at $1 each, a fusty urine yellow doll's tea set. Their noses sharpen. That's 25 bob. Recollections. My visit to Marjorie in bed with bronchitis. She gray and quenched. I brought back the christening gown of Limerick lace from her grandmother's wedding dress she had loaned me and showed her a little picture of Nicholas in the gown. I left Frida in the living room with Ruth Pearson. Marjorie was drinking lemonade. She had that queer camouflaged look of blending into obsequious gray-brown surroundings obsequiously and gray-brownly. So that I would be at an utter loss to describe the furnishings of the room, except to say my impression was of immense and depressed wardrobes, towering. George joined us. They looked at each other. Shall we tell Sylvia our news? I surmised it, good or bad, both. George had been retired. They were leaving in 6 weeks for a flat that had miraculously and independently turned up in Richmond. I felt uncomfortably like bursting out laughing. I managed tears. My worries of C's increasing limpet like cling in the next 3 years disappeared. I could be magnanimous. Almost immediately, they gave me a price list of things they were going to sell. I was astounded. They were letting us have the favor of first choice. The prices were very high. Trust a banker, I thought. You must think my grant installments are a life legacy. My first thought, what in God's name would I want of their stuff? There turned out to be startlingly an antique oak drop leaf table I coveted for Ted. We bought it for £25, which I felt wiped out any obligations to buy anything else, but bought also a handsome round brass tray table and a coal scuttle in brass like a shining embossed helmet and a mirror. The brass and the table complete our living room. The table is a heavenly find. Then they loaded Frida with old toys Claire did not want, showed others that were for sale. I smiled, admired, but said no more about them. Ted went to tea after the scone and Devon cream tea. Came home at 7 after the harrowing visit of the Roses, those ghastly 2 girls. I, very tired and faint, heard 2 voices, flew down with the baby and materialized in the front door. Claire and Ted standing at opposite sides of the path under the bare laburnum, like kids back from the date. She posed and coy. I came out sniffing the baby like a restorative. I just brought back some of Daddy's records, she said. May I come over Friday and listen to your German linguaphone records? I have a better idea, I said, and rushed in and took out the records and booklet and thrust them into her hands. This way you can study them to your heart's content all the rest of your vacation. She had asked Ted if the secretary in his secretary poem was a real person. So hopes begin. For some time I seriously considered smashing our old and ridiculous box Victrola with an axe. Then this need passed and I grew a little wiser. April 21st, I had invited the 3 ladies to tea in George's absence over Easter, visiting his mother, Ruth, Marjorie, Claire. Only Marjorie and Claire came. Ruth had a heavy cold and was sorry. Hilda and Vicky had arrived earlier that morning, surprisingly, and in the heavy rain had helped me clean house. I had baked a big yellow sponge cake. We all sat in the living room for a bit, Claire on the window seat talking to me and Marjorie almost, but not quite, ignoring Hilda and Vicky. Obviously, it was a shock to the Smiths not to be our only and honored guests. Their self-centeredness came out with a violence. Claire told of the vacuum cleaner episode that morning. Mrs. Crocker had been cleaning under her bed when the vac stopped. They extracted a hairpin, but it still wouldn't go. They sent it to the Hawkings for mending. The Hawking boy, Roger, came back with the machine and a pair of Claire's black bikini pants, underpants, I presume, which had been extracted from it. Her idols, Bridget Bardot and Lolita. The sun filled the playroom over tea. Hilda and Vicky and Marjorie and Claire did not mix. I felt very partisan for the former. Marjorie left at 5:45, Claire putting on her stylish white mackintosh. Marjorie had worn the usual buff or dun-colored cashmere sweater with a pleasant buff and black squared skirt. Claire in a navy blue sweater, her very thick legs. April 24, a new and fearsome strategy on the Smiths' part. Claire called up while we were embroiled with the curious blonde Swedish lady journalist to ask if she could come and read in our garden. I was aghast. It is one thing to ask to come around for a cup of tea, but to ask to come and lead a private life in our garden, as if it were a public park, is appalling. I was so fuming at the Swedish girl after Hilda and Vicky that I had a marvelous time saying how we had more company and were all sprawled out in the garden. So no. No. It was just as Ted said. If we get to know people too well here, they will be using our garden as a place to come get a pleasant stroll and free tea. I had an intuitive fear that a lot of them will come today and ask if they can have free run of the place as they are just about to leave, and it, quote, surely couldn't inconvenience us for 2 weeks, end of quote. Later, Marjorie called. She wanted to tell Claire to come home. Claire's not with us, I said. Oh, this gave me a new insight. Marjorie and Claire had arranged, before Marjorie took her nap, as Claire said she was doing when she phoned, that Claire should come to our garden and read, and anticipated no refusal. I had a suspicion that Claire had told her mother we wouldn't let her come in a rage, and Marjorie had said, I'll settle them. I'll call and pretend I think you're there and get to the bottom of this. This is what I suspicioned. In any case, I had a beautiful chance to talk on about our fresh set of guests, and Marjorie was forced to commiserate on my business. Now I can add the excuse of our having a lot of back work to do to give the illusion of sweet, loving charm while refusing. A marvelous art I must develop. Anyhow, I vaguely said Claire had called about coming, but we had company again. What, still? And she had said something about going over to the Bennetts. She had actually said she would read in the Bennetts field. This new tack, I think, was accelerated by Ted's picture and the rave write-up by Toynbee in this Sunday's Observer. May 1st. Claire came over to say goodbye, stocky and white and near to tears, in a school blazer. She had been yelled at by her mother about the loss of a button and more or less driven out. Ted sat out a bit, talking, while I cut the long grass of the garden border with scissors. Then Ted went into his study, saying, goodbye, be seeing you. Very huffily, Claire said, I don't know what you mean. I'm going back to school tomorrow, as if she expected us to extend some concrete invitation to back up the words. It's a manner of speaking, I said gently. We don't like to say goodbye. She sat with me, leafing through a copy of Vogue she had brought and giving a little monologue on each page. Talked of almond-toed shoes and the new round toe. I said I thought it was the old round toe, and how she had bought a blue beret in Exeter, and how wonderful Bridget Bardot was. She had started so many styles. The clock struck 6 and she left. Ted says he saw them all exiting in best clothes from the bank house the next morning to accompany Claire partway back to school and go on to Weston Supermare themselves for a few days. May 6th, saw George coming up the back way, took him into the front room where he bounced Frida on his lap. "Hold Daddy," she cried, wriggling to get down and over to Ted. And past the time of day, very natty in gray suits, red silk scarf and pocket and red ties, if a leashed flamboyance could now show itself, since he was free of bank rules and respectability. He seemed lessened, deposed, slightly abashed by all his leisure. May 7th, the final farewell dinner with Marjorie and Ruth at Burton Hall. I was feeling awful with this crabby bacterial infection, which made me want to rush out in agony to pee every few minutes and felt I might dash home any minute. Marjorie all dolled up, new hairdo, new vibrant self full of stories about self, cutting Ruth off rudely every time she opened her mouth. Obviously trying on a charming new nature in preparation for Richmond. Ruth's stammer bad. An indifferent dinner of steak and custard fruit pudding. Marjorie in gray and white striped spring suit and luster beads, sat in lounge with old deaf woman. New bank manager had been at supper. But M said not a word. Story of selling their Ireland house, the flautist in the other part. The stain on the mantle. The girl lost her engagement ring there, but later found it in her pocket. We left at 9 with a feeling of immense freedom. North Taunton, with the S's departure. An easier, much more restful place.